Good morning, everyone. And we are going to start this morning with Shimon Ullman from the Weizmann Institute, also one of our organizers.
So good morning, everybody. The title is Pre-Language Learning of Conceptual Structures, and you'll see as we go along what I mean by conceptual structures, but it's learning before language is available. And my focus in general is on vision. What I'm interested in and talk about today is not necessarily restricted to vision, but my career and much of my work over many years has been focused on vision. Now we are very good at understanding images as humans, and we know what's happening here, what happened before, for example, and so on. And current models, modern models, vision, language, and so on, can also do quite a good job on this. They do it, though, with huge training, with gigantic language data set. And humans learning really begins very differently. It's, baby basically starts without world knowledge. They watch the world, and based even just on vision, they can, as major input, they somehow learn what's going on in the world around them and develop sophisticated representations of what's around them. And I want to give you some examples. Some of these things are surprising, how they manage to learn without examples and without supervision, and in some sense really understand what's going on. And of course, with this, since we are moving into the decade of models, there are interesting questions regarding comparisons between what infants can do and what models can do, and whether maybe we can combine them and so on. I'll talk a little bit about this at the end. So the modeling that I will describe is always based on quite a lot of experimental data, what we know about what infants can really learn, but with a lot of computational work and results to see if explanations that we think about, whether they do really explain what's going on, compatible with the actual data. And I'll start with two, which were some of the first ones that we worked on early on in modeling this learning, hands and gaze. And we chose them because they're interesting, because they're very difficult. Hands are known to be relatively difficult, so is gaze. Both of them appear very early in the learning of infants, and they become very quickly sort of important and meaningful because they're the basis of subsequent learning about agents in the world, goals, interactions, and you'll see a few examples of this as we go along. So this is from a paper from some time ago. So you can see hands, for example, why they're difficult, partly because they're so flexible. There are so many different ways that a hand can look. And very often they are small, inconspicuous, and still infants can find them, and they know what hands are. I'll show you what it means. So a model would need extensive supervision, and children just pick it up, and the answer is what may indicate the presence of hand in the image if you do not have any outside supervision. And we think, based on some knowledge about early capabilities of infants, that there are two main things that tell us how infants do it. Infants have very early sensitivity to some specific types of motion. The most important ones are shown here. This comes from the work of Michaud. Probably many of you know about Michaud and causality and so on. And the two patterns here is one is called launching by Michaud and others. This is, you can see an object coming and sort of pushing another object and launching it to move. And there is a carry, people also use the name entrain, in which you have an object or an agent coming to make a contact with another one, and then it carries it along rather than pushing it. And we call it, for reasons that will become clear in a minute, we call the carry or the entrain, we call it a mover event. So there are two things that infants are sensitive to. They look a lot and they are interested in mover events. And the other thing is that they have a very surprising or clear special sensitivity to look at the hands of other people while they're manipulating objects. For example, from a well-known study, when they had head-mounted cameras on babies, over months, as you can see, 80% of the frames in the movies showed hands manipulating objects. It's something that they really care a lot about. So the suggestion is that mover events will be specifically associated with hands. And actually, if you look at mover events in the real world, what you will find is primarily hands. And let me show you. When that was the assumption based on what we knew, and we implemented a relatively simple mover detector. I'm not sure. Maybe there is a slide later showing it, but basically the thing that we put into the model, that's unlike learning in a large model. We assume that there are some innate, or at least some of these parts of these capacities are innate, and they emerge and they guide what the infant is learning. And here you can see that we are looking for just images in a variety of videos in which there are mover events, and mover events are described still without knowing about hands, but there is something, basically a region of pixels moving and getting in contact with another region and pushing it or changing it. So there was a relatively simple way to put it into the model, and the question was, what will happen if you look at mover event in the real world? And you can see that when you see, in this case, people manipulating things and so on, but you can see that just motion, the hand, and so on is not particularly informative. But whenever you have a hand manipulating an object, that is relatively simple mover event sort of immediately identifies it and can say. Because as I show you, there's a lot of motion there.
No, you're showing me your algorithm.
Yeah.
No, but I'm asking, how do you know that children, that the babies are not sensitive to motion in general, and it is actually motion of hands?
Okay, because as I said, when you see them, when they start to look at hands, the hands are not just hands moving in the world. By the way, it's not their own hands, but they look at and then what you see, they look at hands during the first 6 months of life and so on. They're looking at hands manipulating objects, and they're not.
And if you have a rolling ball or a mobile,
they're much less interested that there's something special and very strongly. As I said, 80% were hands manipulating while they're manipulating objects. It's a very strong bias that they have. And as you see, that's regardless of what we know about the infants, is that when you look at movers in general, in a large set we had dozens of videos taken from a variety of surroundings, either indoors, outdoors, and so on, and it repeats that what you get when you look for these kind of mover events, they are strongly biased toward the hands manipulating objects. So the idea is that what happens in the background is that the infants are sensitive to mover events. They sort of pay attention to them. If you want, they collect examples, and once you have them, we showed in the study that once you have this collection, it's very easy to train now a network that, based on this, will take it as the ground truth and so on, and it will get high-quality hand detectors. Some additional interesting details to this, but I don't have time to go to the details. But it turns out that you learn almost as well as something that has a large supervised data set and learns about to detect hands in the world. So you can see this something that reappears. It's a combination of some pre-existing structure that apparently that we assume is not experience dependent. It's wired into the system, but to get the hands, it's a combination of the detection of the mover and then using this as sort of one sort of ground truth, and there is a learning phase that gets the hands. It's interesting, and you'll see it in other examples, that it's something nice about infants learning. It's not just labeling, okay, now there is a hand, but it comes together with some kind meaningful about what they are seeing. For example, because they see the hands engaged in other objects, manipulating and so on, they know that hands are sort of manipulators of the world, and it's an important part of the early understanding of the world. And here is, for example, an experiment done by Rebecca Sachs at MIT and Sue Carey, that what the infants see is they see initially on the screen a hand, disembodied hand moving on the screen, contacting a glass. And then later on, after they see this for some seconds, they see either just the hand moving or just the glass moving. They are not surprised by seeing the hand moving, and they are very surprised when they see the glass. They know that the hand was the mover of the glass. The next thing, I'll try to do it briefly, is gaze cues. Where a person is looking at, to know what the person is looking at. And children, again, are very good at this. They look at somebody, they see where the person is looking at, and then they move their own vision, their own attention, and they look at the same object that the other person is looking. And we can do it. You can look at this. Is this person looking at you, or is he looking at the, I don't know, the objects on the, what do you think? Where is he looking at? Can you tell, or it's too far? Mm-hmm. Okay, we do it on the base of the eyes, and the eyes are not very good here, so it's difficult. But it turns out that eyes are also very low resolution things, and they still can use the exact shape of the eyes and what to estimate with high accuracy where the person is looking at. And what we think, and again here I will not go into all the background detail of what we already knew from the literature about the capacities of infants at this stage. But one thing that happens in general, and this was known in the literature, not of infants, but in people in general, that people almost always look at the hand when they establish a contact with an object. If there is an object here and I want to manipulate it, I look at it. Once I have it here, I can do whatever I want, but it's very rare that I will do the... So the idea is that a hand establishing an initial contact with an object, you can be almost sure that the person who is doing it is currently looking at this. So you have sort of the ground truth. You can, on the one hand, look at the target. You know what the person is looking at. You take a picture of the face of the person, and from this you learn that this kind of face is looking in this direction. When we did it, we raised what we thought is something that people should study, that in our algorithm, you see the establishing the contact, but then you have to move your eyes from one location to the other location. And then we found that there was a paper a few years ago, before we did this work, that in fact describe something basically identical to this, that whenever infants look at the establishment of contact with an object, they change their view and they look at the face of the person. Here again, the gaze is a part of something important. It's not just something that it's on its own. It's part of learning about the world, and it's then responsible and helpful for learning other things. As I said, they establish the thing of joint attention, that you and the other person looking at the same thing, and then you can have something in common. It plays a role in social interaction, even in language acquisition. So direction of gaze is something that is very important, and it's a sort of learning trajectory that appears in for all the infants. It's sort of standard trajectory, mover and then hand from this gaze, and then certain aspects of social cognition and language. When we worked on this gaze detection, we were also involved in a study that we initiated. We were wondering, since this looks like a certain special machinery that embedded in us that lets us acquire this important capacity to do gaze following. And we did together with Ehud Zohari from the Hebrew University, who is working with sight recovery of infants that are bilateral congenital cataract, strong cataract. This is in Ethiopia. And basically they behave like they have no sight, like blind due to this severe cataract. And later on, and that's one part of the thing that Zohari is doing while he's doing the research, they also travel around with doctors, and they the doctors do recovery operation, and they can remove the cataract. And we were wondering, since this is a mechanism that is designed, and we have reason to believe that it's something that works only in infantry, and later on you don't have this capacity of automatically combining the hand and the gaze and so on. And that's something that we studied with Udi Zohari. And the specific expectation that we had is that if you do the recovery, the intervention early enough, then infants will have automatically what we have, this automatic gaze following. But if you do it too late, after the year of 4 or 5 years of age, they will not be able to do it. And it turns out to be correct. I will not go into detail, but very quickly, here is the main experiment. You show the infants, or all of these infants were, as I said, they were blind, functionally blind from early on. But the recovery for some of them was done very late, and for others it was done early. And they were tested in this way. They saw a head here looking straight ahead. Then it disappeared, and there was the same head, but looking either to the left or to the right. It's difficult to see here, but it was clear enough in the experiment. This is shown for 300 milliseconds. And then they see either this image or this image, and the difference is that this is called compatible and this is incompatible. The task that they have to do after when this appeared is to touch the balloon as fast as they can. And what happens with normal people without cataract, either children or adults, there is a significant difference in the reaction time, or the ability, the speed in which they can touch the ball. They touch it more quickly if it's the compatible arrangement. And what you can see is, in fact, I see it, that there is about 50 millisecond difference between the compatible and incompatible for late treated infants that sort of missed the opportunity to gain this capacity. There is absolutely no difference whether the person is looking in this direction or another direction. If you do it early, then it's indistinguishable. It's almost as good as being with full sight from the beginning. So something quick, which I will not describe in detail, but there is something here.
What is the critical age?
The critical age, they think that from Zohari, from the population that he had, that it's around 4 or 5, that it remains until then and then it disappears. And people already took it into consideration. People are now trying very hard to reach these people and do the operations as early as possible, because it's not just this particular, but other visual capacities and so on are very, you miss them if you do not do it on time. Something about segmentation or coherent objects. It was surprising to me, and I think for researchers in infants, that how bad they are initially at segmentation and knowing how to divide the world into individual objects. For example, they do not know at the beginning that they don't have no preference whether this is a single object or 2 objects, or if you have to divide it into 2, how to divide it. They don't do it. And later on, and it's not much later on, they can look at images like this with the cars and they identify the individual cars. How do they get there? So, you know, the models that have been done are doing good segmentation, but they use, for example, in SEM, the segment everything. They had something about billion examples drawn by people, some of them, many of them, to reach good segmentation. Now, what we have, humans, as a precursor for segmentation is segmentation by motion, which is very strong. When something moves, it becomes its own thing, and it's different, and when it stops, it disappears. So the general model is that basically you use this, and in fact there are 2 capacities of very early human. You're born with these capacities. This is again some non-experimental. You don't need experimentation as infant. You just have it. You group together everything that moves together, but you're also very good at finding boundaries. Can you see the boundaries? And also in the boundaries, which is in front and which is behind. They really become very good at it. What's behind what? I guess all of you saw which one was behind and which one was. So they get, based on this, we created some segmentation which achieved good results. I will not get into it. I want to use this to move to something which is, to me, was even more surprising, with things that I saw before that infants can do. And again, so we reach a stage when infants are good at static object segmentation, and they can do in front and behind. And are several months during their development, they do this a lot. Apparently, that's the way it's described in the literature. They're really fascinated, or really spending effort to do this segmentation and to decide what's in front and what's behind. Now, this sort of connects to this other strange thing that infants learn early, and that's, I remember even that the first time I saw it in the literature, it sort of took me, this particular paper said that the first relationship that infants learn between different objects is containment, whether something contains something else. And to me, it appears, without any specific knowledge on this, that containment is something relatively complicated, and how comes this is coming up very, very early. So infants can know that the evidence shows that they know that these things that I show here, these are, although they look different, they are both containers, and in this case, it's a containment relations and so on. So they learn it. And the question is, how can it be learned? How can you look at the world and decide that something is a container or something is contained in this other thing? And it starts to appear in 3.5 months of age already. And the idea is that while they're very busy finding what's in front of what and doing segmentation, then containment is a special event of paradoxical occlusion. If you look at the object on the left, you have object 1 in front of object 2. But if you look at the other one, you have object 2, which is in front of object 1, which is in front of object 2. It depends on where you look. So you have both of them. You have this double relation and not a simple binary relation that one is in front or behind the other. So this creates, when you see it, it's sort of the infant, that's the assumption. They treat it as a special event. Here is not what I usually see, the in front or behind. There is this two objects with a paradoxical occlusion relation, and I'm not going to detail this. It involves a number of observations, but basically, if you just try to implement it, it's very straightforward, and you get to reliably detect detections of containments. It also predicted a number of things on how this will develop. The most straightforward of these is that containment seen from above will be more difficult than containment look from the sideways, because if you look down on something, then you do not see the paradoxical conclusion. And it turned out that this is something very well known in the literature, that they learn containment very early, but containment from a high view is significantly delayed beyond the. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is we've done work on other things, but I guess you can see sort of the drift and what's going on in work that they're doing now. And this is okay. I'll do it as quickly as I can. It will not be much more than it, maybe two more minutes. So giving and taking events, this is something now in progress. It's related to social interactions. And one reason we are very interested in this, you will see it now depends not on individual concepts, something like, say, paradoxical occlusion, but on putting together a number of different already known concepts and creating a more and more hierarchy of concepts that become more and more sophisticated. This is a small part of it, but that's the general drift. So what is giving and so on? It turns out that infants distinguish between giving event and taking event. Here is something taken from an actual, something that was used in infant testing. So you show these infants, and in this case, you can guess what was it, what's the event. Yeah, it's a relatively simple given event. So they do it, and they distinguish between this and taking, for example. You may have noticed the initial motion of the green the recipient, moved before everything else. And this is because children distinguish when they look and see things like this and this giver sequence. It depends, among other things, that the recipient must be an agent, a live agent, and not an object. If it's an object, they do not treat it as a giving, even if the same sequence, but instead of the green thing that moved around, there was an object, they would not treat it as a giving. So just to show you that they really understand some aspects of giving from the beginning. Okay, so you notice that what you have here is not real life and not real experience, and it's even surprising that experimenters just, instead of using some real imagery. They just created this thing. They expected the infants to be able to see this as giving, and instead it turns out, and this is the main reason I think that we wanted to study this, is that a large variety, all of this, what you see here, are all examples of studies of infants, young infants, while they're trying to detect or evaluate their ability to distinguish between giving, taking, and other things. And you see that some of them are very sort of symbolic, others are real life, and there is no, all of these things, infants look at them and they know that it's giving. So it's an interesting computational question, how you design some kind of a capacity or machinery which is in the brain or partly already in the infant's brain that doesn't care. All of these things are the same and they can tell whether or not it's a giving result. So it's really highly variable, and it's not clear how you treat all of them as giving. And it turns out that they really understand, if you want, the basic or the fundamental common structure, that it doesn't depend on how the agents look or what is the object that is being transferred, but to have a given event, you need an animate agent that carries an object and towards another agent, and then the recipient contacts the object, and the carrier, the initial carrier of the object, releases it. So all of these things should happen in order to decide that this is a giving event. And what is shown here is in red is like I took the sentence that just described what giving is, and everything that is shown in red are already concepts that infants know about when they get to learn about giving. They know what is animate, they know what is to carry, and so on. This is already mastered sometime before they get into the giving. And then also they put these different components into a more complex description that allows them to deal very efficiently with this range of giving events. So for example, these are 3 frames from the video that you just saw. If you give an infant the first one, they already know that this is a carry event. If they look at this part, they know that this is already of establishing contact, and this is an example of releasing contact, and the contact between the blue agent here and the apple is released. And if you combine these 3 things that they already know, that it gives you a very strong evidence for giving. So, and with this, I think I'll finish. Or the last couple of comments is that in fact, I showed in the previous slide, for example, the concept carry. Carry by itself is something that is built from previous and simpler concepts that the infant know about. They know basically that carry is that there is an animate in contact with an object, and they move together. And this together, when you put it together, these are tell you about carry and so on. So you can see that they develop already, this is the first year of life, they start to develop a sophisticated hierarchy of concepts, and a more complicated concept based on combination of what they have built in with learning based on that, and the learning quickly complicates it. Let me, for the cost of time, let me just show you some results from the last couple of weeks. This study is with Shifi, Traeger, with here. Shifi, raise your hand, he's around here. So I'll just show one more slide, and the slide is we compared the learning of giving in three configurations. One is standard deep network. We give it example of giving and taking events, so that it has the ground truth and it learns, the model learns. The other one is that going partially towards what infants does, that we have a DNN, but we implanted, in addition to what the model creates as the description of the embedding of the image that the model sees, we implanted also whenever there was a contact, and wherever there was motion in the image, just the simple agency object move, and to see whether these concepts help the model to learn. And the last one is to have the full hierarchical conceptual structure that I showed, that takes the simpler one and creates things like carry and some other more complicated ones. And as you might expect, and this is work in progress, so all the data is, in this case, is artificial data and not real data in the world. So it's in progress, but it already showed what we suspected will happen. The DNN has difficulty learning. If you add some relevant concepts, results become better. And if you give the full hierarchy, then it becomes even much better. So let me finish here, but the last slide is just a question based on this. Can large pre-language systems help intelligent models? So we saw all this on infants. Can something like this be combined with models, maybe make them more human-aligned, maybe make them more intelligent? And my feeling is that maybe yes, and the point I want to raise is the following, that there are two senses to pre-language. There is pre-language of the infant, that the infant learns before the infants get acquainted with the language, but it's also something about human evolution. Until the language appeared just 30,000, 50,000 years ago, and until then there was no language. So there was Homo sapiens around, very sophisticated, but without learning. So there is something about brain doing learning pre-language in this sense. Now, the Homo sapiens before language, as I said, was a very good learner, a very good, very successful animal, and in certain senses, very smart and a good learner. And this was in the brain of our species, say 30,000 years ago, and it didn't go anywhere. So probably the same kind of pre-language that existed in humans already exists, and it's already inside us. So it sort of makes sense that probably it can still contribute, and it's not all language. And it's interesting to ask and to explore whether the combination of the pre-learning machinery that we have in our brains together with the later language interact and do things together and help each other. And I think there are ways to test it. For example, could be interesting of teaching large language models, but not to a naive model, but to have a model which is first trained to be human-like, to have as much as we can of the pre-language abilities of humans before language, and then add the language that will, the language teaching and the already existing relatively advanced pre-language machinery we have in our brain, whether they will interact, will combine, and will produce something which is different and interesting compared to current large language models. So let me stop here, and okay, so this is the end. Sure. I mean, fine with me, but
You can take questions while I'm going to set up a lotion.
To go back to hands, one of the first things that infants see and get direct, proprioceptive and tactile feedback from, and probably rewarding in terms of grasping a breast, a bottle, or whatever, is their own hands manipulating things. So might it not be that the early interest in hand movements is in fact experience dependent?
yeah, no, it's a good question, and I didn't have time. I have a slide on this, but in the paper that I cited, it's discussed in detail. It turns out the own hand comes significantly later, much later compared to the hands they learned are other people's hands, and later on you get their own hands. So we do learn it, but later on. And also, when you look at the brain with fMRI and with other ways, anyway, they are not quite, the areas are not exactly the same. There is an area that's specialized in other people's hand, and nearby there is a sub-area that specializes in their own hand, which develops later compared with the others' hand. So it plays a hand, it's important, they have to know what is the hand, they later use it, but it's a somewhat separate and more later learning that they do with own hand.
Okay, we're going to do the rest in coffee because we're a little bit over time. Thank you so much, Shimon.
Sorry, this is already the
Yes.
question, sorry.